So the good folks over at Dehancer contacted me maybe a month ago, 6 weeks ago, something like that now, and asked me if I'd be interested in trying out their software. Now, I wanted to give the software a bit of a good go before I actually did anything about it, and they wanted a blog post written first anyway, so I've done a blog post for them. But I've been looking at shooting images as if they were taken on film for a couple of weeks now, and it started with using black mist filter from K&F to try and soften some of those edges and make things less clinical. And then in my last video I went out and explained how I was going to shoot with a 24 shot challenge and just take images using my digital SLR, but 24 pictures only. And in this video with Dehancer I'm going to try and recreate the feeling of film when I edit those images. This is where the process starts. Every photograph begins out here in the camera, and editing for me is an extension of that piece of work. So if you start out here, if you get the image wrong at this point, then no piece of software is going to bring it back from where it originally started. You're never going to get it better than it was when you took it. You can add an effect, you can add different filters to it, and you can add things over the top, but they're all layers over the top of your base image. So the photograph that I've taken here, and I'll put a scene up so you can have a look at it, was basically looking down on top of these cascades, these rapids coming down towards me, with these branches of this tree coming out over the top, and that frames it nicely. And there's a bit of lighter trees in the background, a little bit of autumnal colour. Concerns with this image, exposure. We've got a lot of highlights in the image, and to try and combat that, I've put a polarizer filter on, so that with a bit of luck with the polarizer, it'll tone down some of those highlights. So that was actually a couple of weeks ago now that I went out with the camera and took those photographs. And the reason I've left it for a little bit of time before I actually come back and edit the images and share them with you is because I wanted to spend a little bit of time with the Dehancer software before I make a fool of myself and not be able to explain it very well. So I'll spend a bit of time with it. I'm actually really quite impressed. It was quite surprising because initially I thought I was going to struggle with it and not enjoy using it, but I've been pleasantly surprised. I've developed a little bit of a workflow, so we're going to start with that really, and it begins with inside of Lightroom to start with. So let's have a look and I'll explain to you what it is we're going to do. So if we just pop into the develop module, this is the image which I'm going to work on. I'm not going to go through a lot of it in Lightroom because this isn't a Lightroom video. We started off with a very basic image, fairly flat. It's got everything in the tonal range. It's a little bit difficult to handle it up in the field, but you'll see up here that there is some sort of blown highlights and things, but I'm not overly worried about that. It is very, very minor. So I'm going to run through very, very quickly the changes that I made inside of Lightroom just to get you back to where you are. We started with my import, and on my import I always actually do a little bit of, clicking the wrong buttons, do a little bit of lens correction, and that's done inside automatically with the profile on import. So we've done a bit of chromatic aberration. We've enabled the profile corrections as well. I had to go in and do a little bit of a manual bit of work with the defringe, and if I zoom in, you might just be able to see it. It may not come up very well when you look at it, but hopefully you'll be able to just see that there's a little bit of edge on there still, and just pushing that up to about +5 just sort of helped me a little bit with it. Sorry, that's the wrong one. What I wanted to do it was on that +5 on the purple. There you go, it's already on there, look, +5 on the purple. So that actually sort of boosted the defringe amount and made things a little bit better. So once we had done that, I moved on to looking at denoise. It was important that we applied the denoise to it as well. I always start with denoise. It does make a little bit of difference, I find. So we go into detail on this, and we're not going to go into any of the sharpening things just yet. We'll click on the denoise button. Okay, so it's actually done that now at long last. We've got the DNG version. If you look up in the top left-hand side of the image there, you'll notice that it has created DNG. I'll probably cover that at some point in one of my Lightroom videos, but I'm not sure. Now, the other thing I want to do with this as well is I do want to have a look a little bit at the sharpness. I just want to make sure we've got some nice details in there. We don't want to overdo it or anything, but I do want to boost it just a little bit because I think it will take it. And if we go up to there, back a little bit, yeah, or maybe around the 85% mark. So I'm quite happy with that. Let's go back to fit that on the screen. So that's lifted it a little bit. Now, to me, it looks a little bit dark. So we're going to go into the bit of basic editing. And we're just going to bring up the exposure a bit. Maybe a whole stop. We'll have to see how it goes. Yeah, I don't want to go much more than that. Yeah, that'll probably do about there. It's brought up those highlights and those blown out areas a little bit, but I'm not worried. I really am not worried about it too much. Now we're going to set the white and the black points, and we'll do that by holding down the Option key and then just pulling the blacks back until we start to get a little bit of clipping. And there it is. And then we're going to do exactly the same with the whites as well. I'm going to bring the whites up to about there. And then we're going to adjust the shadows and the highlights as well. So we go into the highlight area. We're just going to bring the highlights back. And that'll hopefully bring back some of the detail in the top left hand corner, which it has. And the blacks, sorry, the shadows as well. So that's the highlight, shadows, whites, black point set, exposure adjusted, denoise done, and we've done a little bit of work on the sharpness. And that's all I'm going to do. I'm going to export this file now into Dehancer. And we go up to Edit In, and we come down to Edit in Dehancer Lightroom plugin and click on that. It's going to export it as a TIFF. Color space is Adobe RGB 1998, 16 bits on the component, resolution 240, no compression, edit with Lightroom adjustments. Let's hit it. So here we are, opened up. So finally, here we are inside of Dehancer. Now, when it opens up, you've got a menu down the left-hand side, some more controls on the right-hand side of the screen, and the image that you're working on is in the middle. So it's fairly familiar to anybody who's worked in any image editing software. You can switch these menus on and off, so you can have a look at them. You make your image a bit bigger. It makes it a bit easier to work on sometimes, or you can leave them on. It's entirely up to you. Now, anything that you want to do inside of Dehancer, you need to select by putting a tick box on. So you can click on all these films as much as you want, but nothing will actually happen until you click on that box, and then it will use whatever's been selected. Now, I actually know that I want a color negative film, and I actually know the sort of film that I want to use. And from experience and from listening to other photographers, what I'm going to be looking for is probably going to be one of the portraits. And in fact, if you look at it, you'll see that I've already marked the Portra 160 NC as a favorite of mine. So it's a little bit flatter, a little bit less punchy and contrasty than the other Portra films. But to be perfectly honest, they're all pretty soft, gentle films anyway, and I like them for landscape photography. So let's click on Kodak Portra NC. So now it's applied the basic edit to it. And you could leave it at that point if you wanted to, but we're going to do a little bit more editing to it on the right-hand side in a moment. Now, before we go any further, I just want to explain to you why the input from Lightroom is important and why I've adopted the workflow that I have. So I took quite a bit of time, well, not a lot of time, but a reasonable amount of time to make sure that the image was as good as it could be inside Lightroom. I could have put it straight in here and edited it straight from the raw file. But in this case, what I want to do with this type of editing process is to make sure that the image which I'm putting across into Dehancer is as good as it possibly can be before it gets here. And the reason for that, I'm working on the assumption that that bit that I did in Lightroom is in camera. That's an extension of in camera, is extension of correcting those various faults and errors, getting your exposures right and everything, and bring it across. So now I can assume that I'm going to now work on the best possible image from inside the camera that I possibly can. And I'm going to begin my edits. So what can we control? Well, there's a lot of terms down the right-hand side here where we've got source, film developer, film compression, expand, print, color head, film grain. We're not going to use absolutely every one of them, but we are going to go through them quite quickly if we can. Don't worry about some of these terms. They actually did really quite confuse me, but if you go on to the Dehancer website, there's a huge amount of information on there, which is really quite easy to read and understand. So we're going to start over here to begin with. Now I'm going to open up source for you, but I'm not actually going to use source because we've already dealt with the exposure compensation. We've already dealt with the temperature compensation, tint, defringe radius. So for film developer, well, actually film developer works exactly the same as the menus do on the left-hand side. If we want to activate it, we've got to press this little tick box. Now what am I going to do inside of here? Well, what I really want to do is I want to boost that contrast a little bit. I think it needs coming up a little bit more, not a huge amount. Or maybe I'll reduce the contrast, actually reduce it a little bit more, because I like really quite images with, I like photographs which really aren't that sort of contrasty. Sorry. So I'm going to set it at about -14. I'm not going to really look at some of the other controls on there, but what I like about this is that it really does give you a feel of how it would have worked inside a wet darkroom. I'm fortunate enough to have worked in a wet darkroom, and typically we would have done this by changing the way the temperature and the concentration of the developer itself. So it really does work quite well. So film compression. Well, film compression tends to work on the way in which how the highlights get to the point where they're blown out a little bit. It's a little bit hard to explain. And what I found is that if you look at the moving water on this, when I actually click on it under its default settings, there's a lot more detailed information now in the moving water. Now, you can play about with these quite a bit, and you can play with the way how impactful it is. You can reduce that completely. You can mess around with the color density. You can mess around with a few different settings in there. I'm actually quite happy with the way that it is set up. So I'm going to leave it exactly as it is, as its default. Expand. Now we're going to talk about expand, but I'm not going to use it. So expand is normally used for black and white film. And that was really when you would want to sort of expand the black point and the white point to give you a much wider sort of tonal range or reduced tonal range. I'm not going to do it on this image, but if you want me to go through that later on and show you some examples, then please, let me know in the comments and we'll see what we can do with that. I kind of struggle a little bit with the idea of print, and the reason for that is because I'm still looking at a screen. Print on this is to try and get the image to look in a way how it would look on the printed page. Now, if you're actually going to print something, you're going to put down a printed paper anyway, which isn't really going to reflect what you've got here. So I'm not sure exactly how that's going to work. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to click on print anyway. And it does allow you to have some different options on there. You can have a linear one or various different print films. And I've decided I'm going to select the linear one. And the reason for that is I thought, well, actually, this will allow me to play with the target, play with the exposure, the tonal range, color densities, etc., without actually picking a particular paper. Because if I eventually print this, it's going to go on a different digital paper anyway. So I only made some really, really minor adjustments. I think I want to bring that exposure up a little bit, just a tiny bit. You can probably barely see it, but I'm going to bring it up a fraction anyway. The tonal contrast, I probably want to adjust this a little bit, just to sort of give it a little bit more contrast in there. You can just see it creep up a little bit. I don't do it a huge amount because I still quite like that sort of flat effect that we've got, but I'm going to bring it up a bit anyway. Color density. Color density, well, like it says on the tin, really, it's how dense the actual colors are, how deep they become on the screen. I'm not really going to alter that much. Saturation, I like it to be a fairly sort of low saturation on this. I like my colors quite muted. So actually on this image, I'm going to use it to bring it back, not a huge amount, maybe around 80, 90, 88, 90, yeah, something like that. So that's absolutely fine. Now the color head is really quite an interesting way of working. If anybody's actually worked in a color darkroom, they'll know exactly how this works. You would be able to change the yellow, blue, magenta, green, cyan, red, light, and add a color cast or remove color cast of things from your film. from your image. So I just want to add a little bit of warmth into it, and you can do that in the shadow tones, and you can do it in the warm tones as well. So I'm just going to bring them all up just a tiny bit, not a huge amount. I don't want a huge amount in there. Up they come, and that's just putting a little bit more warmth in the shadow area, midtones, and highlights as well. So I'm quite pleased with that. So now we get into some of the things which really sort of set print film away from digital images, and that's like grain, halation, and bloom, and these type of things. When we start looking at film grain, it's important to realize that something fundamentally is different with film than it is with digital. Film is made up of grain. You know, the silver halides embedded on the surface are what are affected and what capture light. So film isn't a layer so grain isn't a layer over the top of the emotion. Grain is a fundamental part of it. And Dehancer does this very well because it doesn't put a layer on the top. It actually works with the image by deconstructing and rebuilding the image with that grain in it. So I think it's a quite unique way of doing it and a good way of working. So as with the other things, let's activate film grain. Click the down arrows so we can see what we're looking at. And I actually like the starting point of 65mm film, ISO 50, which gives me a good starting point. Now what you find when you click those, it will actually set it, but you can go up to the custom button, hit the custom button, and now we can change it about a little bit. Now I've actually gone in on one-on-one on this so we can see a little bit better on the screen what I'm talking about. But what I actually like to do is to reduce it. So I'm going to actually knock this down by 50%. And you can with these controls, if you know what you want and what you like, you can type it in directly rather than having to, sort of use the sliders. And that's what I've done there. We just take it down to 5. So I'm going to leave it. You can deal with the resolution. You can change how it affects the shadows, the midtones, the highlights. You can change the color of the grain. There's all kinds of different controls that you've got in there. And really, I'd urge you to download the free copy of this. And I've got a special offer coming up as well, just to give it a go. So let's zoom in on the top corner here, because this is where we're going to see halation. If I click this on now, you will just see that little soft glow appear around the edges. So halation is where you get like the red-orange edge around the outside of sort of like high contrast boundaries and light sources. So what I've done here is I've switched it on, and once again with it, I'd sort of like, I don't want too much. So I start at the 65 to 70, and that seems to work quite well for me. And then, you could pull it back a little bit if you wanted to. It's entirely up to you. You could do that by going into custom, and then you could sort of mess about with it. You can pull it back and change things. But for the purpose of this video, I'm just going to leave it exactly where it is. One of the nice features you've got on it is the mask mode. And if you switch the mask mode on, then you can actually show exactly where it's appearing, what edges it's on and what edges it isn't. So that's quite a nice little feature that you can just control it, and you can control it visually. So we're just going to double click and put it back to how it is at that setting. So let's turn the mask mode off, get rid of the halation menu, and go into bloom. Now bloom is another one of these things where you only get it with film. And what you tend to get with film a little bit with bloom, it simulates the dispersion of light around those high contrast boundaries. And in this image, we've got the water and the rocks. And if I once again go into the 65mm 70, I think it gives me a nice effect. And then if I go into custom, I can then actually change the way that this looks. So I could bring it right up. So we've got impact. And you can see the overall image sort of like suddenly take a softer feel to it. And it does that because what you're getting those softer boundaries between some of these areas. Of course, I've made it so big, it's covering quite a wide area. So let's get rid of that. Set that back to how we want it to be. Okay, so I never really wanted to take images where my film was damaged. So I'm not going to cover film damage in it, but if you were doing it for some creative reasons and you wanted some lines, some scratches, some dust, some hairs and stuff on it, like you would printing in the traditional darkroom that we would strive to spot out, you could do that. Overscan is basically where you scan an image and you have some of the film leader, the gap between the individual frames, or the sprocket holes down the side showing as well. Not really relevant for the type of work that I do. And the other thing that you've got as well is vignette, which is kind of self-explanatory. So the other thing I want to comment on is if you're a wedding photographer or something and you want to do a whole batch of images like this, unfortunately, Dehancer doesn't have the ability for you to actually apply a batch process to it. But what you can do is you can save these setups as your own preferences. So I can save this now. So I did this yesterday. I created one called Kodak Portra 160 NC. Natural low contrast. And if I click on that, that's basically the settings which I used yesterday, which are pretty much identical to what I've got here today. So let's put the before and after shots up to think about. Answer the question that I started with at the beginning of the video. Is Dehancer the answer? Well, I think the simple answer to that is actually yes, it probably is. When you look at the before and after images, they're definitely very different. The film one has got a muddier, more organic feel to it, which is kind of what I was trying to go for when I did this. I certainly like the low contrast effect, which I've managed to bring out. I could have processed it entirely differently. I could have used different film stock. I could have used it, a color positive film rather than negative film as well. And it's got plenty of different options there for you to mess around with it. So regardless of what your own preferences are and styles are, there's plenty of controls here that you can use to alter it. It's not a preset and walk away. The controls on this are phenomenal. But having said that, Dehancer isn't the whole story. It's not the whole story to getting back to the basics, getting back to producing that film feel. And if you want to find more out about that, then check out this video next.